Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Fragile pause. The U.S. and Iran agree to a 2-week ceasefire if Tehran reopens the Strait of Hormuz, but the path to a permanent deal remains unclear. Oil slumps in the news. The agreement is also set to allow Iran and Oman to charge fees on ships transiting through Hormuz. And while the White House says Israel backs the ceasefire, Prime Minister Netanyahu says the truce does not extend to Lebanon. Well, it has just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Well, we got a ceasefire. It's a pretty different outcome from what we expected going to sleep last night. Of course, things could have turned out very differently if President Trump had followed through on some of those threats to strike at civilian infrastructure within Iran. But in the very last minutes, about 90 minutes before that deadline, a ceasefire was agreed to. So we are going to discuss throughout the course of this show what happens from here, whether it's going to hold, what details we have, and also, as ever, the reaction of markets. So how exactly are markets reacting to this news? Positive news, obviously, and the reaction and the handover from Asia has been quite robust. So the MSCI Asia Pacific up 4.6%. No surprise there. Take a look at S&P futures leaning very green as well, up 2.4% this morning. So pointing to a very strong open. European markets, 5.2%. They are pointed to open significantly higher. And of course, we've been talking a lot about the knock-on effects on the European continent of higher energy prices. This and the fact that there is a potential for a full de-escalation is positive news. But again, hold your horses because there's still lots of questions that remain unresolved, especially as it pertains to the Strait of Hormuz. But European markets up 5.2%. And then that's the emerging market index, MSCI, also up 4.2%. And emerging market assets overall in the past 40 days have been quite heavily sold down. So perhaps this marks a turning point for EM. Now let's switch over and talk about those all-important energy assets. What is oil doing this morning? Take a look at Brent. We are down 13.4%, just shy of $95. So we've tumbled around $15 over the course of the last 12 hours or so. But I would still caution, we're still about $20 to $25 a barrel higher than where we were before the war started. There's still a significant amount of geopolitical premium here. We still don't understand what is going to happen to the fate of the strait, so to speak, whether Iran are going to continue to exercise the so-called control, monitoring which vessels pass through, and questions still about the extent of the disruption that sustained at some of these key energy infrastructure sites around the region too. So some lingering questions there. Take a look at nat gas futures as well, pointed to open down about 4.3%. So here we're looking at U.S. gas, Dutch TTF not open for trade, but expecting a large impact there too. And then the USD slipping. It had benefited over the course of this war. So safe haven status being unwound a bit. We're down about 0.8%. And then gold is, well, doing a little bit today. It's up 2%, just shy of 4,800. So that is the scoreboard for how markets are doing. Let's go back to the geopolitics and the main news from overnight. A fragile reprieve in a worsening conflict in this region. The U.S. and Iran have now agreed to a 2-week ceasefire, sending oil prices lower and lifting global stocks. U.S. President Donald Trump announced the agreement on social media, but cautioned the pause hinges on the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Pakistan, a key mediator, is set to host negotiations between Washington and Tehran on Friday. Joining me now is Stuart Livingstone-Wallace, Bloomberg's executive editor for Middle East, North Africa, and Russia, and Patrick Sykes, Bloomberg's breaking news editor in Istanbul. Stuart, let's just start with you. How did we get such a dramatic turn of events in the last 12 hours? What led to this ceasefire?
Good morning. So, I mean, largely it seems to be efforts by primarily Pakistan that put forward this proposal for a 2-week ceasefire. And certainly Iran has been giving credit to Pakistan overnight for that effort. But it's also clear that there presumably were other countries involved. There's been some suggestion that China put some pressure on Iran to, at least come to the negotiating table. And I'm sure as the days unfold, other key nations will sort of emerge as having played a part in this. But certainly for now, most of the focus seems to be around Pakistan and the efforts that it's made on both sides.
And I guess the major question that people are going to be asking is whether the ceasefire can actually hold, Stuart. And of note, the Iranian National Supreme Council released their 10 points, their terms for what they would like to see in order for this ceasefire to become a permanent cessation of hostilities, many of them very maximalist demands.
Yeah, and let's talk about that ceasefire to start with, because as you know, as of this morning, attacks were still coming into the Gulf and into Israel. There appeared to be some attacks inside Iran. So the ceasefire has not really taken place. And, you know, that's to be expected in these situations. Normally you have a period where fighting continues sporadically for some time and then sort of things hopefully settle into a more peaceful sort of tone. But in terms of those sort of key demands, you're absolutely right. I mean, we don't appear to be any further forward in terms of reconciling what Iran is asking for and what the US is asking for. But we have these talks supposedly starting in Islamabad on Friday. That's yet to be confirmed by all sides. But again, that has been confirmed by the Iranians. We're waiting for kind of firm confirmation from the US. And then hopefully at that sort of 2 weeks of talks or thereabouts, we may end up with common positions on lots of issues. But looking at it this morning, we don't seem to have moved any further forward in terms of what both sides want.
Yeah, and that's the core issue there. Patrick, how are the Iranians framing the ceasefire?
Yeah, we saw images there of Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader, and I think it's worth mentioning the Supreme National Security Council statement mentioned that this happened with his explicit approval and guidance as well. So the Iranians are clearly keen to, you know, amid all the speculation about his whereabouts, his health. Remember, we still haven't seen him on camera. They're keen to say that he's very much part of this and he's leading the Iranian side of it. I think on Hormuz, the key part is that the Iranians said that the transits would continue with, or that the strait would be open to transit with coordination with the Iranian armed forces. I think it remains to be seen exactly what that entails. Does that mean as long as you speak to us, you're clear to pass, or does it mean something more like what we've seen over the past couple of weeks, where it's more of a discretionary system where you not only have to get in touch with the Iranians, not only have to sail through their waters and between much closer to their coastline than you normally would, but you also have to have their explicit approval, and in some cases even we've reported pay a fee for the privilege. So I think there'll be guarded optimism around Hormuz. That's why we've seen the obvious reaction in the oil price, but you mentioned the oil premium that still exists versus the pre-war period, and I think that's because there's still a lot of uncertainty about not only how long this ceasefire would last, but exactly how these transits will work in practice.
And Patrick, we said from the very beginning that for Iran, this war was an existential fight, and if they could come out the other side of it, even though they were going to be weakened or fighting an asymmetric military battle, as long as they came out surviving, this would be framed as a victory. Is that the situation we find ourselves in today?
Yeah, very much so. They're already framing it as a victory, right? In their narrative, this came about as a result of a US request for an end to, or a pause in hostilities. And they're also keen to stress the Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. He said that the US accepted as a general framework Iran's own 10-point proposal as a basis for further talks. That's those exact maximalist claims that Stuart was referring to. So Iran is trying to claim that its position, maximalist though it may be, is the one that's going to form the basis for the next stage in diplomacy. And then the Security Council, the Supreme National Security Council statement that you alluded to, that was much more laden with, you know, this is a victory for the people of Iran as a result of our unity, as a result of our steadfastness together with the resistance front, that being, of course, Iran, together with its regional allies like the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas.
Stuart Livingstone-Wallace, Bloomberg's executive editor for Middle East, North Africa, and Russia, and Patrick Sykes, Bloomberg's breaking news editor in Istanbul. Thank you both so much. Let's continue the conversation now with Dalia Fahmy, associate professor of political science and director of international relations and diplomacy at Long Island University. Dalia, good to have you on this morning. Are you optimistic this ceasefire is going to hold?
Unfortunately not, because we've already seen a little bit of violation on both sides. But let's look at what the kind of details of this so-called ceasefire are. Iran didn't just give the United States a peace proposal, but really a kind of plan of action for the future, where it's looking in its 10-point Maximus plan for a lifting of all U.S. sanctions, compensation for damages, regulating the Strait of Hormuz under Iranian military coordination. But I think critical here is this $2 million per ship toll, which would stand to generate $87 billion for Iran, a country that makes just about $50 billion annually on its oil. So the tolling of the strait is where it sees its kind of future income. Interestingly enough, hidden in this 10-point plan is the idea of sovereign rights, which some are signaling that Iran is building into it, future perhaps uranium enrichment. And so what we're seeing in this plan put forward is that Iran is actually perhaps putting a proposal for the future, for its future, a kind of guarantee, taking advantage of this moment. If you look at this on the U.S. side, the goalpost of so-called success has shifted significantly. Initially, it was complete regime change, then complete destruction of the ballistic military capacity, and then it moved to nuclear enrichment, and now it's simply opening the Strait of Hormuz, which is what we heard from President Trump today. The strait was open before the war. And so what this signals is that in terms of coming to the brink, which we were at just a few hours ago, it seems that Iran perhaps is in a position with a greater bargaining range than the United States is.
All sides seem to be framing this as a victory. And I was just noting some comments that the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, put up, painting it as a victory for the U.S. and that they had largely achieved their military objectives. Do you see this as a victory for the U.S.?
It's certainly not a victory in that the United States has nowhere achieved any of its military objectives. Actually, the war has cost the United States much more than anticipated. But in terms of U.S. strategic positioning in the world, we know that our European allies are quite frustrated with the United States. We even heard President Trump yesterday go after South Korea and Japan and Australia for their lack of support. So we're seeing the United States increasingly isolated. Interestingly enough, the country that has emerged as a global power player is Iran. Other than Iran, it's been Russia and increasingly China. We know that it might have been China that put its finger on the pulse to actually, the scale, if you will, to shift the negotiation for this ceasefire. China has significant power to gain from this just by sitting by and allowing for perhaps the future tolling of the strait to be in the Chinese currency rather than on the petrodollar, which would significantly weaken the U.S. economic standing in the world. So we're seeing in this increasingly multipolar world the reemergence or creation of a new pole, and that is Iran and its ability to make significant demands on the system, but also make significant financial gains and perhaps alter the future of the petrodollar, given what we've seen in the past 5 to 6 weeks.
Such an important point regarding perhaps a structural change in terms of the strait and how vessels will transit through it for the foreseeable future, if it does, of course, happen. Let me also ask you about the other front, that is the Lebanon front. Israel active war with Hezbollah, and it is interesting that just a couple of hours ago the Israeli Prime Minister did make some official remarks saying that Israel had subscribed to the U.S. ceasefire proposal, but that it would not include Hezbollah from their perspective. How do you read this?
Well, ultimately, it's really about, if we look at a kind of a larger scale view of this war, and was it in U.S. strategic interest, or was President Trump drawn into the war because of Israel? We could be at a point where Israel is repositioning itself as the important lever even during this peace process, because if it doesn't perhaps get what it wants in terms of being able to further expand in Lebanon, then it could be the country that dismantles an important element, strategic element in the future negotiation. So while we do talk about U.S. and Iran negotiation in Pakistan, especially starting on Friday, Israel still plays a kind of wild card into the future of the kind of fragile peace that has been established for the past few hours and what is going to be negotiated on Friday.
Yeah.
One of the 10 points is a hands-off of Lebanon, and that obviously has already been violated.
Dalia, thank you so much for joining our show today. Dalia Fahmy, Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of International Relations and Diplomacy at Long Island University. Thank you. Well, up next, the head of public markets at Shuaa Capital, Aarthi Chandrasekaran, unpacks how markets are digesting the ceasefire agreement between Washington and Tehran. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jemana Versace in Dubai. Equities are rallying on optimism that the U.S.-Iran ceasefire could pave the way for a more durable resolution to the conflict. But continued reports of attacks in the Gulf following the announcement underscore just how fragile the truce remains. Joining us is Aarthi Chandrasekaran, head of public markets at Shuaa Capital. And I will just say, despite the fact that markets are cheering on this news, it is worth pointing out that just in the last 10 minutes, sirens are going off in Bahrain. We're hearing of more projectiles being intercepted across the Gulf. So some question marks as to whether or not the ceasefire actually is effective. And so as it pertains to markets, do you think markets are once again jumping to the conclusion that this perhaps is a resolution to the conflict when it actually isn't?
It's definitely a positive headline, Jemana. I mean, it gives you an interim relief to the market, which is obvious, but then the uncertainty, in my view, lingers on. I mean, if you look at S&P has been having a lot of optimism in the ever since the beginning of April, and that's not even related to geopolitics. It's all because of the earnings estimates, which has been inching up higher, and the hard data, be it GDP, be it ISM, be it PMI, everything, or the retail sales has been way more resilient than expected. So I guess volatility is likely to persist in the coming days. Market is going to be nervous. It's not going to go in one direction, but more likely sideways. You're going to have more opportunities to pick up if you have missed picking up in the downturn.
Yeah, and I guess the other big question for anyone involved in this market is what happens exactly with the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran are still once again reasserting their right to sovereignty, still going to try to maintain effective control of who's transiting through the strait. That's going to have knock-on effects to energy markets. And how do you read how long it's going to take perhaps to return back to normal, if indeed we can price in returning back to normal?
The geopolitical risk premium has faded a bit since we spoke about ceasefire last night. I mean, of course, oil has come down by by around $95. But that being said, again, I guess it's very unlikely for us to go back to pre-war period, even if there is going to be a permanent ceasefire. It's very hard to talk about $60-70 of oil, even if it's going to be a permanent ceasefire, because you have so many things like a supply chain, import-export flows, as well as refining activities, which is going to take way more time to return back to normalcy. So I think oil will stay elevated probably in the near future.
What does that mean for the emerging markets complex? One of the things that I listed, what I was talking about at the top of the show, is EM assets, specifically Asia also, got quite aggressively hit throughout the course of this war. Do you see a scope for a rebound there, or is it going to be capped because of the potential impact higher energy prices will have still on those economies?
I think the rebound will obviously be there because of whatever is happening with respect to the ceasefire, although it's very temporary until the time we know what actually happens post that. But I guess energy prices makes a very different kind of a spectrum as far as emerging market are concerned, because a lot of these has to flow into the markets, into the inflation, into the food prices. So we got to see what the central banks in emerging markets would do. They probably might have to get a signal from the Fed, because they might not really lead the Fed, but rather follow the Fed. And it depends on the monetary policies as well, how the markets there would react.
Yeah. The other question, of course, is how you think interest rate investors are going to respond to this news today. And again, you have to dissociate between the short-term relief and perhaps the longer-term impacts of some of these higher energy prices still being worked through the system, the potential inflationary impact down the line. Where does that leave central banks?
I think with European central banks might be an outlier. We do expect ECB and Bank of England to possibly, look at hiking rates or have a tightening bias, I would say, because they're very sensitive to inflation. They're very sensitive to the wage growth and obviously the energy shocks. That being said, Fed would probably be on hold, probably be on a wait and watch mode. But there's a bigger question here is in terms of the bigger uncertainties about the transition of the Fed leadership that happens in May. And I think that is something which the market is totally undermining, what the new Fed chair would do when he comes into to take position in May. It's quite possible that he might actually be supporting growth or leaning towards supporting growth rather than thinking about the upside risk to inflation. And we might have a rate cut, which is why I'm still factoring in 2 rate cuts, maybe in Q3 and Q4, despite where the inflations are.
Yeah, and we're seeing the dollar sell off this morning. It briefly got a bout of support through the last 40 days of this war, but the trend throughout 2025 and the beginning of this year was one of dollar weakness. Do we go back to that trend, do you think?
Not really. Yes, it will be. It depends again on what the central bank or what the Fed would actually would try and do about this. I guess the kind of narrative the Fed has to play, the kind of interest rate cuts or interest rates hold periods that we might get, that would totally be biased on the dollar. Dollar has had a great run so far, and again, it depends on the economic growth as well. I mean, higher energy prices for a longer period of time, it's going to act as a drag on the economic growth, and then it might not be it might be detrimental to the dollar again.
Aarthi Chandrasekaran, thank you so much. Head of Public Markets at Shuaa Capital. Thanks for joining our show today. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following. Iraq's Kataib Hezbollah says it has decided to release American freelance journalist Shelley Kittleson. The Iran-backed militia said on Telegram the move is conditional on her leaving the country immediately. Kittleson was kidnapped in Baghdad last week. Authorities in Abu Dhabi have been called to a fire incident at a gas complex in the Emirates, according to the government media office. A post on X says emergency services are responding at the Habshan gas processing facility. No details have been given on the cause. And let's go to the break, taking a look at how some of these key markets are reacting to news of ceasefire in the region. S&P futures up 2.5%, soaring higher. NASDAQ even more, up 3.1%. Take a look at European markets. European stocks futures up 5.5% as we head closer and closer into the European Open. So absolutely ripping here on news of this tentative pause. A relief, no doubt, especially for some of those European nations very reliant on energy exports coming through from the region. And let's switch over as well and take a look at the energy complex. Clearly, a lot of focus on the price of oil this morning. And what we've seen is that Brent has plunged about $15 throughout the course of the morning, down almost 14%. WTI also down about 15% as well. But crucial here, and one of the bigger questions for this market is going to be what exactly is going to happen with the Strait of Hormuz and whether it will be fully reopened for all vessels transiting through without a fee system in place. And at this point, we don't have long-term answers to those questions, hence still some geopolitical premium being priced in to oil. Now, coming up, the U.S. and Iran agreed to this ceasefire deal, but key questions remain over Iran's nuclear program and what comes next. We'll discuss that next with retired U.S. Army General Mark MacCarley. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Fragile pause. The U.S. and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire if Tehran reopens the Strait of Hormuz, but the path to a permanent deal remains unclear. Oil slumps on the news, with Tehran saying safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz will be done in coordination with Iran's armed forces. And while the White House says Israel backs the ceasefire, Prime Minister Netanyahu says the truce does not extend to Lebanon. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Joanna Bersachi in Dubai. Well, as you were talking about, ceasefire is the name of the game today, but the real questions about whether this is going to lead to a sustained truce, a more permanent resolution to the war that has been encapsulating the region for over 40 days now. So a lot of optimism being expressed in markets, but I would say a good deal of skepticism too by some of the experts and analysts in the region who have concerns about whether this can actually lead to a durable peace resolution. But for now, Asia Pacific, handover from Asia, pretty positive, up 4.8% for MSCI Asia Pacific. S&P futures up 2.5%. European markets soaring this morning, up 5.5%. Obviously not open for trade yet, so pointed to a very stellar open once things do get going in a couple of hours. And then MSCI emerging markets also seen poised to open up in the green. And these are really parts of the market that got heavily beaten down throughout the course of this war. So what's gone down the most is rebounding the most visibly this morning. As for energy assets, take a look at where Brent is trading. That's been the key release valve, I would say, of most trading and sentiment over the course of this war. Just shy of $94.50 here, so $94 a barrel. We're still about $20 to $25 higher than where we were before the war. And again, big question for investors where we go from here is what is exactly going to happen to the Strait of Hormuz and whether there's going to be a free flow of vessels through it. And remember, there's a good chunk of vessels, about 800 to 1,000, that are estimated to be stranded in the Persian Gulf right now. So it's also going to take some time for the backlog to get through, assuming that things go back to normal. So bear that in mind. Gas futures also seen pointing to open down in the red as well, down 4.3%. This is Henry Hub, but TTF in Europe expected to open even more in the red when they get going for trade in a few hours' time. USD slipping today, the greenback down 0.8%, and then gold just above $4,800 now, up 2%. So some money going back into gold, given its underperformance over the last 40 days. Not a big surprise there. All right, let's also check in further detail in Asia, how things are faring there. Min Min Lo is in Hong Kong for us.
Hey, Jumana. Yes, a big sigh of relief in markets today. We are seeing that rebound rally underway in Asia, led by the Kospi up by 7%. Most of these benchmark all seeing a strong rebound here. The Hang Seng returning from that long weekend up by 3%. Regardless of whether this ceasefire, there's still questions around the durability of a long-term plan and exit out of this war. But investors are latching on to that temporary hope of this suspension of attacks for the next couple of weeks. You flip the board and take a look cross assets at how currencies are trading, for example, and the US dollar is pretty much weakening against every major currency, whether it's DM or EM. And here you can see the Japanese yen now at a 158 handle, coming down from the close to 160 level that we saw just a day ago. The dollar yuan also now at 683. This is the strongest level of the yuan that we had seen in about 3 years. We continue to see very strong fix from the PBOC this morning, suggesting suggesting that the PBOC continues to support the strength in the yuan, that they perhaps continue to expect the dollar weakness to continue as well. And bottom of our screens, we're going to show you the Kiwi dollar as well. We did have RBNZ holding rates steady today, although there was some hawkish language coming out of the RBNZ. They are expecting inflation to spike in the near term, and they said they will decisively hike rates if inflation doesn't come down to 2% in the midterm. Very quickly, just take a look at how yields are doing. You flip the board, and we are seeing yields, right, coming down mostly across the board here, led by Australian yields down by 0.1% there, and traders mostly pricing out that fear of inflation a little bit. And interesting that Chinese bonds in particular actually not moved at all throughout all the headlines that we got this morning. But of course, the Chinese inflation picture is very different from what the rest of the world is seeing.
Yeah, and also another central bank we need to add to the mix, RBI, keeping rates unchanged at 5.25% and saying that upside risks to inflation outlook on oil and weather have risen. So there are upside risks to the inflation outlook. But of course, they would have been using information from the past month or so. So let's see how the environment is going to evolve in the next couple of weeks with the main geopolitical news of the night. Let's talk more about that. The US and Iran have agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. Now, that is a move that could pause the conflict after 6 weeks of fighting. But while the deal is expected to halt attacks for now, key issues remain unresolved, from the opening up of the Strait of Hormuz to broader tensions over Iran's nuclear and missile programs. Joining us now to discuss is Mark MacCarley, retired U.S. Army Major General and Managing Attorney at MacCarley Rosen. Good to have you with us. The question that I've been asking, and I think everyone is asking today, is whether this ceasefire can actually lead to a durable peace resolution. What's your view?
Well, let's just say that most of us are breathing a huge sigh of relief that the guns have been put down, at least for a while. But you realize that this ceasefire has been in existence for less than 4 hours. And whether this ceasefire remains intact without violations, and I'm significantly concerned about information that I have recently received, that there are still missile attacks on Bahrain, and this is during right now, the pendency of this ceasefire. But the hope, I think, for most is that during this 2-week lull in hostilities, both sides will look to take advantage of the situation in order to come to some sort of agreement. Of course, no agreement is going to be acceptable, completely acceptable to both sides, but it's perhaps an opportunity, a step in the right direction. But right now, it is so early in order to interpret the implications of this ceasefire and what's going to happen.
What about the significant amount of military assets that the U.S. has accumulated in the region? The aircraft carrier that is here, the other one that is on the way, the thousands of Marines that have been deployed to the region. Do you expect them to stay here for as long as the ceasefire is in place the next couple of weeks?
Quick answer, and I'm going to say it's a relatively easy one. Yes. There would be no movement and no direction. Of course, I'm speculating. I'm no longer within the Pentagon establishment. But on the other hand, it takes a significant amount of energy, people, money to move that size of an armada from the United States. Certainly, we brought a couple of those marine amphibious ships from as far away as the waters surrounding Taiwan. And so for the United States, it's my belief, grounded in experience, that the U.S. will retain and maintain those military assets. Essentially, they're marking time.
You know, let's go back to the the military objectives that the U.S. were looking to achieve throughout the course of this conflict. And top of mind, and this is something that President Trump has reiterated time and time again, they want to ensure that Iran don't go on to develop a nuclear weapon. Can they definitively say that they've achieved that objective in the absence of obtaining that enriched uranium stockpile? Iran is thought to be sitting on 400 kilos plus worth.
You know, we reach back, I like to reach back to June 12th last year, when both Israel and the United States struck the uranium enrichment facilities at Isfahan and Fordow. And immediately after what we considered successful attacks, we employed the big bunker buster bombs. There was a proclamation, a statement that it looked to us as if a significant amount of uranium nuclear capability had been destroyed. And then lo and behold, move forward now 8-9 months, and we're still focused on that same objective. There is information, some substantiated, some not, that a significant portion of that nuclear stockpile remains buried someplace in those locations that I've just outlined, described, and that from our perspective, the objective of completely eradicating from this time forward Iranian ability to develop nuclear weapons and to employ them has not yet been achieved. So that's why when you look at least the immediately published demands, the ceasefire demands from the United States, there's continued emphasis. Number one, by the way, is a degradation of Iranian nuclear capability.
Yeah. You know, I just wonder whether out of this, and you know, you yourself and others have mentioned that sort of the goalposts shifted the longer the war went on for. And today, Iran are painting a picture of victory, because from the outset for the regime, as long as they didn't disintegrate, as long as there was no regime collapse, they were going to frame that as a victory. What do you think the face of Iran looks like as a regional and a global actor now, 40 days on after this war, with this new point of leverage that they've gained, which is the Strait of Hormuz?
There's no question that the number one success, which frankly we should have anticipated, is Iranian control, its throttling of the Straits of Hormuz. That's truly what we call in my trade success in an asymmetric campaign. Iran could not really prevail in the missile contest between itself and the United States. Certainly there have been attacks into Israel, the Gulf states, even further. But at this point, Iran, the regime, to the extent of our knowledge, still retains power. It has the Straits of Hormuz. And with all that put together, and with its ideological fervor, it has come forth and proclaimed to the world that it has beaten, to use this inappropriate reference, big Satan, and perhaps little Satan as well, if you understand those references, of course, to the United States and to Israel.
Mark MacCarley, retired U.S. Army Major General and Managing Attorney at MacCarley and Rosen. Thank you so much for joining us today, a pivotal day for the region. Well, oil slid the most in almost 6 years after the U.S. and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. Stephen Sachinski, who leads Bloomberg's Asia energy coverage, joins us now. So more fireworks in the energy space this morning, seeing a dramatic reversal in oil markets. Paint a picture for us and what some of the lingering concerns are for traders out there.
All right, so clearly there's some good news and some, unclear news, right? So the good news is that the ceasefire means that there will be most likely no more hostilities for the next 2 weeks. That will be cramped down. That means that the market can have a sigh of relief in terms of potentially more damage on other facilities of infrastructure. I think that was a big fear as this was going on for the last month. As to you wake up, you look at your phone, and you see that something in Qatar or something in another area had been hit. A refinery was, seemingly always hit. So because of that, that was something that was always pushing up prices. And the fear that if there was larger damage to infrastructure, then potentially, even if there was a peace deal, then you could see these outages last for weeks and months. Now that risk is being removed from the market, and I think that's where you're seeing this drop in prices. Now we're in the $90 level. We're not back to where we were in February, which is more the $60, $70 level for Brent, which indicates that there is still a risk premium. And I think the risk premium is the unclear bit, which is the Strait of Hormuz. We really don't know how those ships are going to go through. We don't know what's at play there at the moment. And that's what the market kind of wants to understand a little bit better.
Yeah, I mean, our understanding from this ceasefire is that tankers will be able to cross the Strait of Hormuz, but, and this is the language that Iran are using, in coordination with the Iran armed forces. Do we have any visibility on how many vessels will be allowed to transit through and what sort of impact this may have on outputs?
There is very little visibility, and it's also unclear as to other details, like the AP was reporting that Iran could still charge a toll for going through the strait. It's unclear how many ships will be able to go through on a daily basis. Over the weekend, we saw traffic increase the most since the war began, 20 ships over the weekend. But of course, that compares to 130, 140 ships per day before the war. Are we going to get back to pre-war levels? I think very few people in the market, analysts, expect it to get to that level just because there's so much churn and there will be so much confusion. Could we get to 20%, 50%? Maybe, but that's really the bit that I think the market wants more clarity on. It's also unclear how the order will go. There are 800 ships in the Persian Gulf. Who gets priority, right? This is going to be a bit of a jam. So that also takes a bit of coordination that could slow things down. I watch liquefied natural gas very, very closely. I haven't seen any of the 19 LNG ships in the Gulf really head toward Hormuz yet. So maybe they're waiting for more clarity, and that could come up in the next few hours or days.
Yeah, so while we await clarity on the Straits and who's going to pass through the Straits and so forth, I think there are other sort of more medium-term questions. And let's not forget that, many of the major energy companies in the region have declared force majeure on some of their customers, on their contracts. We're talking about a significant amount of physical damage that's also being sustained at these energy infrastructure sites. And how much of that is going to hang over the market in months to come?
Absolutely. I mean, even if the Strait of Hormuz were to open up, that's a release valve because a lot of facilities are offline. Qatar's, let's look back at LNG for a little bit. Qatar's massive LNG export plant, the world's biggest, was damaged. 70% of it was damaged. Will take years to repair. It's been offline for over a month. How does that come back online? What's the trajectory for that, parts of that to resume? There is something interesting that happened over just last few hours, reported out of Tokyo, that Chiyoda, one of the big engineering firms that does work at the facility, is considering to resume construction there, which does mean the companies are considering now that there's been a peace deal, whether or not to put staff back at these facilities, because as there were attacks day after day, these facilities not only were damaged, but they also evacuated staff. So if there's no staff on site, you can't resume. So we need to look at not just repairs. Is it safe for the staff to get back there? Do the companies trust that this ceasefire will continue and will allow for safety at these facilities? So there are a lot of unknowns in terms of the infrastructure. But again, going back to the original thought, because of the ceasefire, the market at least is interpreting it to, hey, maybe there will be no more damage going forward. Maybe there will be no more attacks. And that is something that is bearish for the market and likely pushing prices lower today.
Yeah, Stephen, really great to have you on. Thank you so much. Stephen Satinsky, who leads our Asia energy coverage. Well, Well, coming up, questions still remain over the ceasefire deal and Israel's conflict against Hezbollah in Lebanon. We'll discuss that next. This is Bloomberg. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel backs a U.S. ceasefire with Iran, but he's made clear the deal does not extend to Hezbollah in Lebanon. For more, we're joined now by Bloomberg's Dan Williams in Jerusalem. Dan, how significant is this Israeli signal that the fighting will continue in Lebanon?
It's significant, sometimes drowned out behind the headlines. The hue and cry of the war in Iran has been the fact there is a second front to this war. That front is between Israel and Lebanon, specifically between Israel and Lebanese Hezbollah. Now, for many Israelis and for many Lebanese, this is as consequential as the Iran war, the main war, in a different way, but nonetheless consequential. The Israelis have now committed some 5 army divisions to that invasion of southern Lebanon, intended to drive back Hezbollah away from their border, away from civilian communities, to reduce the range of their rockets. And if this Iran deal holds, this Iran ceasefire, if it involves into a wider ceasefire, maybe even a peace deal, Israelis are unlikely to be satisfied as long as the situation hasn't materially changed on that border with Lebanon, where the threat is far more tangible and immediate than the overarching threat for Iran 1,000 miles to the east. So the Israelis are openly saying they're not committed in Lebanon to the ceasefire. Iran in the past has conditioned any ceasefire on it being held on all fronts. That's a coded reference to Hezbollah, its ally in Lebanon. The question is whether this Israeli position is a deal breaker from Iran. I assume it's at least tacitly understood and accepted by the Trump administration.
Yeah, and indeed, the Pakistani Prime Minister also seemed to suggest that the ceasefire would apply to Lebanon. The Israeli Prime Minister has a different perspective. When it comes to the ceasefire itself, does the Israeli Prime Minister, does Benjamin Netanyahu actually believe that the existential threat from Iran to Israel is actually gone now? Could this lead to lasting peace? And how is this going to resonate with the public?
Well, Jumana, as with you in Dubai, here in Jerusalem, this announcement by Trump and Iran was received right in the middle of the night. In addition, in Israel, it's smack in the middle of the last day of Passover. That's a Jewish holiday. Customarily, the Israeli civil service, the Israeli government does not work, doesn't even answer its phones as spokespeople. That has actually given Netanyahu and his staff and his coalition partners something of reprieve to understand this deal, a deal that's still emerging. As you noted, it's rather murky when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz. The Israeli position, to judge by that rather terse message statement put out in English 4 hours after Trump announced the deal by the Netanyahu administration, his message 4 hours after the announcement was that Israel supports this U.S. decision to refrain from firing as long as the Iranians refrain from firing. It also said that Israel supports U.S. efforts to achieve other elements, other stated aims of this war, namely a cessation of other threats seen from Iran. I imagine behind the scenes, the phone lines will be worked very hotly now to try to understand exactly what the Trump administration has agreed to try to understand the prospects of a compromise deal, something that would be less than what the Israelis would have hoped for in this very costly and unprecedented war. Keep in mind, Trump is meant to be here on the 21st of April, Israel's Independence Day, to receive Israel's biggest prize, the Israel Prize. That's a day before the ceasefire is scheduled to end. If he attends, presumably there'll be much celebration, perhaps not as much as there was when he came last October, if the Israelis believe that this deal sold short their vital national interests. For now, there is cautious support. There is reticence. In 12 hours' time, when this holiday ends, we'll probably be hearing a lot more from the Israeli government, the Israeli Prime Minister, his coalition partners, and of course, the Israeli populace when it comes to polling as to whether Israelis think this war was worth it.
Yeah, well, another date for our calendar, April 21st, it is. President Trump expected then to visit Israel. But of course, that is one day before the end of this 2-week ceasefire. So let's see. A lot can happen between now and then. Dan, thank you so much as ever for your reporting. Dan Williams in Jerusalem. Well, one thing I wanted to take a look back at was just some of the key assets and how they fared throughout the course of this 40-day war. We've chosen a couple here, but just to flag, you know, the S&P over the course of the last 40 days down 4.2%, MSCI Asia down 5%. So not a huge amount, but still, you know, a bit of a sell-off has occurred in equities, and of course. The bigger moves have occurred in energy markets. Brent is still 35% higher than where we were before the war started. And gas, European gas, also up 70% still since where we were pre-war. So some significant moves for markets still to digest in the coming weeks and months. But that is it for Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Bersachi in Dubai. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.